once again, everybody, and welcome back to the League of Shiva Commish report. This time it's the playoff special. Now, I know I didn't have a Week 12 report. I do apologize for that. However, I'm going to quickly run down what went down in Week 12, and also we'll do a quick rundown of Week 13 as well, which was the final week of the fantasy football regular season. Then we're going to take an in-depth look at the two playoff games coming up for Week 1 of the playoffs. So let's get right to it. First of all, let's wrap up Week 12, starting with what I would call the matchup of the week from Week 12, and that would be the Binghamtons beating my Big Fat 77s 104-94. Now, my last Commish report, I was talking about how everybody always has a bye week with the Binghamtons and everything. Well, I ate my words pretty quickly in Week 12. And I'll tell you one thing right now. John really knows how to smack talk. A lot of things I probably shouldn't say here on the air, so and I won't. But he definitely knows how to smack talk, even though he's a basement team and not in the playoffs. But anyways, a quick recap of that one. My Big Fat 77s were winning for the entire matchup all the way up until Monday Night Football, and then Anquan Bolden got John's Binghamton a 21-point performance, helping him to come from behind and beat me. So I guess I had this one coming after referring to John as the Sacco of the league, and as I said, stating that back in the past, I've mentioned that everybody gets a free bye week when they go see John, when they go play John in fantasy football. So again, I ate my words. The win by John's Binghamtons actually created a situation where in Week 13, the final week of the season, if I had lost to Jeff, if I had lost and Jeff had won and outscored me by more than 60 points, he would have actually wound up overtaking my spot on the top of the division. Happy to say that did not wind up happening. But moving on to what I would consider in Week 12 the poop matchup of Week 12, and that's the Some Things You Can't Unsee Bros, Timmy's team, beating the Hump Day Camels 81-78. Now, that's only a 3-point difference, but based on, I'm calling it the poop matchup simply because of the score being so low, but Hump Day Camels were only 3 points away from really having a good chance at stealing the 6th and final seed in the playoffs. This did not come to pass, however, but she did have a long shot hope in Week 13 nonetheless. So to finish up Week 12, there were three blowouts that all pretty much seemed to be fitting, considering who wound up being the blowout-er and who wound up being the blowout-e. Starting with the Philly cheesesteaks beating the Google This All the Way 132-73. This was the only matchup that had major effects on standings. Google This All the Way needed a win. The win caused Jeff's Philly cheesesteaks to actually have a shot at the first seed and a first-round bye week. Moving on, the New Hampshire Madmen 122-77 over the Nocho Cinco. That should have happened, so it was nice and easy for Dave, solidifying his playoffs hopes with the win and moving to 7-5 on the season. Nocho Cinco was already out of playoff contention in Week 12, so the loss really did not matter one way or the other for her. Finally, for Week 12, the Dougtatorship beating the Mile High Social Club 124-65. Doug continuing his winning streak in Week 12 and total end-of-season domination that he's had. This win over the 10th place Mile High Social Club at the time was his 7th in a row, and that was after starting the season 1-4. Doug held on to that top seed in the South Division. Okay, that's it for Week 12. I told you to be quick, and now we're going to move quickly down the line on Week 13's matchups, and where there was a lot on the line for all of the playoff teams. So we'll start off with what I'm calling the matchup of the final week of the season, and that matchup of the week was the Some Things You Can't Unsee Bros beating the Dougtatorships 126-114. This was not only what I consider to be the biggest matchup of the final week of the season, I'll go out on a limb and say that it was the biggest matchup of the entire season. There was so much on the line in this one. First of all, Timmy's Some Things You Can't Unsee Bros needed a win in order to keep his top seed hopes alive in the Shiva South Division. If Doug had come away with his 8th win in a row, he would have smoothly sailed into the 2nd seed. However, here's the kicker with this situation. The tiebreaker in the division standings is points 4. That being the case, it made it a necessity for Timmy to beat Doug by more than 43 points exactly. That did not happen, as Dictatorship winds up with 1,500 overall points for, and Timmy finished up with 1,469 points for, a difference of only 31 points. So that was the difference maker in the first seed, or the second seed of the playoffs. Had Timmy been able to win by more than 43 points, he'd be sitting pretty with a first-round bye week to start the playoffs, but that does not happen. And even though Timmy snapped Doug's 7-game winning streak, it wasn't by enough points to overtake him. That being the case, Timmy took the 4th seed and starts the playoffs this week by playing in a matchup against the 5th-seeded New Hampshire Madmen. More on that in a moment. Both the Some Things You Can on Bros and Dictatorship end the regular season with an 8-5 record. Doug gets the 2nd seed and first round bye week in the playoffs, and Timmy ends up with the 4th seed and must play in week 1 of the playoffs. Moving on, there is no poop matchup of the final week of the season. All the matchups were pretty good. However, I suppose if there was going to be one, it probably would have been the Philly Cheesesteaks and Binghamtons tying at 118. Now, this one came right down to the wire, and the win actually went to Philly Cheesesteaks, which I'll get to in just a moment here. In fact, it was almost a win by Binghamton, which would have been his 2nd in a row after beating me in Week 12. Even though John's Binghamton's playoff hopes are completely over, and were so several weeks ago, he still took pride in almost taking down all of the top-tier teams to wrap up the season and possibly foil some people's plans for postseason appearances. The only player left on his team, or on either team that is, was on Monday night, and that was John's kicker, Seattle's Steven Hauschka, or Hauschka, I don't know how you really say his last name. He needed 11 points from him in order to win and only got 10, so that stinks, but Philly Cheesesteaks wind up taking a win from this as the quarterback tiebreaker. Even that was close. Jeff's quarterback was Matthew Stafford, who beat out John's quarterback, Tom Brady, 30-29. So with the extremely slight victory by Jeff's Philly Cheesesteaks, they end the regular season at 9-4 and take the 3rd playoff seed. Binghamton finishing up at 4-9 on the season and 8th out of the 10 overall teams. Speaking of close matchups being decided on Monday night, the New Hampshire Madmen squeaking out a victory against my Big Fat 77s. 107-105 was the final there. After losing to Binghamton in Week 12, I lost my 2nd straight matchup in a row to Dave's New Hampshire Madmen. Dave really needed a win here to help his chances of improving to the 5th overall seed. A loss could have pushed him down to the 6th seed and actually potentially out of it, depending on if he had gotten help elsewhere. Going into this past Monday night game, which was a 34-7 decision in favor of Seattle Seahawks, who hosted and crushed the New Orleans Saints, the only player left on either my or Dave's lineup was, of course, quarterback Russell Wilson for Dave's team. So I would have won if Wilson had gotten anything up to and including 37 points. He winds up getting 39 points from Russell Wilson and slightly edges me out. Dave ends the regular season with 2 straight wins and finishes at 8-5, as my Big Fat 77 still managed to finish at 9-4 despite losing 2 straight matchups to end the season. And I also took the 1st seed in the playoffs with a first-round bye week. On to the Google This All the Way, taking out the Mile High Social Club 138-106. Not a whole lot to say about this matchup. Chris's Google This All the Way took care of business, taking out Dan's Mile High Social Club. Dan finishes out the season at 3-10 and is the 9th overall seed going into the consolation playoff bracket. Chris needed this win to guarantee him the 6th and final seed in the playoffs. Chris was really hoping that my Big Fat 77s would have beaten Dave's New Hampshire Madmen, as that actually could have catapulted Chris into the 4th or 5th seed. Nonetheless, a respectable season for Chris, as he also now has a 1 out of 6 chance of being the league champion. Finally, a matchup that had no playoff implications whatsoever, or very, very slight, I should say, playoff implications, was the Hump Day Camels, 144-93 over the Nocho Cinco. A rough season for my mother Deb's Nocho Cinco, as she finishes the season with a lowly record of 3-10. She winds up losing her final 3 matchups and finishes in the 10th overall position heading into the consolation bracket, which starts this week. She could wind up playing in the Sacco Bowl in 3 weeks, or she could wind up finishing in 7th place overall. So that's the beauty of the playoffs, really. Even if you're not in the championship bracket, you can still keep yourself from finishing in last place, even if you finish the season in last place. We'll see how that goes. Linda's Hump Day Camels really needed a win in week 12, but lost by 3, as I mentioned earlier, to Timmy. Had she won in week 12, her week 13 win over Nocho Cinco could have actually snuck her into the 6th seed. She would have needed Chris to lose and not put up much of a fight in his matchup. None of this comes to pass, and unfortunately, the Hump Day Camels wind up falling just short of playoff hopes. She begins the consolation bracket next week in the 7th overall seed, but the 1st overall seed on the consolation side, and finishes the season with a record of 6-7. So that's it. The regular season is nothing but history at this point. The playoffs are set to begin, so let's take a quick look at the championship bracket and kick off the playoffs right now. Okay, so as you can see, my Big Fat 77s and Doug's Dictatorship are the top 2 seeds, and we'll have the luxury of being spectators in Week 14 of the NFL, which is also Week 1 of our playoffs here in the League of Shiva. Even though the playoffs technically start tonight, nobody actually has any players in their starting lineups that are playing in tonight's Houston Texans-Jacksonville Jaguars game. The only team that actually has a choice of playing somebody from tonight's game is Chris's Google This All the Way, who, as of the time of this Commish report, has wide receiver Andre Johnson on his bench. Johnson's projected for 14 points, and the 2 matchups are the Some Things You Can't Unsee Bros going up against the New Hampshire Madmen, and the Philly Cheesesteaks taking on the Google This All the Way. One little stat that is interesting to mention here is that all 4 of these teams playing in Week 14 are actually coming off of wins. So now let's take a closer look at these 2 matchups right now. Okay, the first of the 2 quarterfinal matches is the 4th seeded, the Some Things You Can't Unsee Bros, taking on the number 5 New Hampshire Madmen. This one could prove to be a total shootout, as both teams have had hot and cold moments throughout the regular season. Based on NFL.com projections, and as the teams' lineups stand as of today, Dave's New Hampshire Madmen have a slight advantage, being projected for 144 points to Timmy's 134 points. An interesting choice, at least so far, is Dave will be going with Chicago backup quarterback Josh McCown. He has time to make a change at that position, and the choices he has on his bench are Robert Griffin III and Russell Wilson. Timmy has the choice of going either with Drew Brees or Andy Dalton. I'm thinking he'll most likely keep Brees in there. New Orleans is coming off a tough loss at Seattle and taking on a hot Carolina team this week, so Brees could have a huge day or a not-so-huge day. Other notables that are currently on Timmy's bench include Rams wide receiver Tavon Austin, projected for 12 points, and Dolphins wide receiver Mike Wallace, projected at 15 points. Notables on Dave's bench include, as I already mentioned, RG3 and Russell Wilson, as well as Redskins wide receiver Pierre Garçon, projected for 14 points, and Buffalo Bills running back C.J. Spiller, who is currently projected for 12 points. Even with these notables on their benches, I'm willing to go on a limb and say that these 2 lineups you see here are most likely what will be the Week 14 playoff lineups. I doubt you'll see either team change anything. However, they do have 3 days to make any changes they see fit. Moving on to the second of the quarterfinal matches, we now take a look at the 3rd-seeded Philly Cheesesteaks taking on the 6th-seeded Google This All the Way. As of right now, Jeff's Philly Cheesesteaks are projected to win this matchup 145-128. These 2 lineups also have the potential to be changed before kickoff on Sunday. As I mentioned earlier, notables on Chris's bench include Arizona quarterback Carson Palmer, who is projected for 20 points. Chris has gone with Tony Romo almost all season long, though, so I don't think he'll make a change there. Others on his bench with potential of becoming a game day decision include Houston wide receiver Andre Johnson, as I stated earlier, is playing tonight in Jacksonville, who is projected at 14 points. Eagles wide receiver Riley Cooper, also on his bench, projected at 11 points. And for Philly Cheesesteaks, I don't anticipate him changing his lineup prior to Sunday. But if he were to make any changes, his most notable options on his bench are quarterback Matt Ryan, who's projected at 16 points. However, Jeff has gone with Matthew Stafford almost all season long as well, and he's projected, as you can see here, for 27 points. His other bench options are Bills wide receiver Stevie Johnson, projected for 10 points, and Browns running back Chris Ogbanaya projected for 10 points. And Chiefs wide receiver Dwayne Bowe, also on his bench, slated for 14 points. But as I mentioned before, I am willing to bet that these are the lineups that will actually be played by these guys come Sunday and Monday. So that's it. That's the in-depth look at the playoffs for the League of Shiva starting off this weekend. And that concludes this Commish report. So thank you all for watching, and be sure to join me next week as we will break down these two playoff matchups and also look ahead to week 2 of the playoffs. I will leave you now with a quick 5-second look at the final season standings. And thanks again for joining me, everybody, and I'll see you later.